1867. The village of Thornwick, nestled in the fog-choked moorlands of northern England. A farmer's spade struck something hard beneath the earth. Not stone, not root, wood, old wood, rotting at the edges but still intact enough to hold its shape. He brushed away the soil with calloused hands, revealing the lid of a coffin that had no business being there 15 feet from the nearest churchyard, buried shallow and crooked in unconsecrated ground. When the village constable pried it open 3 hours later, he found a woman's skeleton. Her jaw was unhinged. Her fingers were bloody stumps. The interior of the coffin lid bore deep gouges, scratches carved into the wood by human nails. She had been buried alive, and she had died trying to claw her way out. The discovery should have sparked outrage. Instead, it sparked silence. Within a week, the coffin was reburied without ceremony. The constable's report vanished from the parish records. The farmer who found it sold his land and left Thornwick forever. No investigation was launched. No name was given to the woman in the coffin. The village, it seemed, had agreed to forget. But why? What sin was so terrible that an entire community would choose to bury the truth along with the victim? And what kind of man condemns his own wife to suffocate in darkness, knowing she will wake before the end? History is filled with graves, but some graves hold more than bones. They hold secrets too dangerous to exhume. Before we go further, I want to know where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment. I read every single one. Because this story, this forgotten piece of history, isn't just about one village in 1867. It's about the things we choose not to remember, and whether we should. Let's begin where it actually started. Not with the coffin, but with the marriage. 1862. 5 years earlier. Thornwick was a place that time had abandoned. A cluster of stone cottages pressed against the moors, where the wind never stopped and the rain fell like penance. The villagers worked the land, attended church, and married young. They lived and died within a 5-mile radius, and most of them liked it that way. Strangers were rare. Scandal was rarer. And when both arrived in the form of Thomas Grieves, the village didn't know what to make of him. Thomas was not from Thornwick. He had come from somewhere South London, some said, though he never confirmed it. He was educated, well-dressed, and spoke with the careful diction of a man who had learned to hide his origins. He had money, though no one knew where it came from. He rented the old Ashford estate on the edge of the village, a crumbling manor that had stood empty for a decade. And within 6 months of his arrival, he married a local girl named Eleanor Pritchard. Eleanor was 23, the daughter of a blacksmith. Beautiful in the way that small villages produce beauty quietly, almost apologetically. She had dark hair, pale skin, and eyes that seemed to carry some private sorrow even when she smiled. She was devout. She attended church twice on Sundays and once on Wednesdays. She helped her mother with the washing and her father in the forge. She was, by all accounts, a good girl. The kind of girl who deserved a good life. Thomas courted her with flowers and poetry. He walked her home from church. He spoke to her father with respect and to her mother with charm. He was older, 38, to her 23, but that wasn't unusual. He was wealthy, or at least wealthier than anyone in Thornwick. And when he proposed, Eleanor said yes. The village celebrated. The vicar blessed the union, and on a cold October morning in 1862, Eleanor Pritchard became Eleanor Grieves. The first months of the marriage seemed ordinary. Thomas and Eleanor lived quietly in the Ashford estate. He traveled occasionally, business, he said, and she stayed home, tending the house and the garden. She still attended church, though less frequently. She still visited her parents, though the visits grew shorter. She seemed subdued. That was the word the village women used, subdued, as if marriage had dimmed some essential light inside her. But no one asked questions. Marriage changed women. Everyone knew that. And Thomas was a good husband, wasn't he? He provided for her. He never raised his voice in public. He never drank to excess or gambled or philandered. If Eleanor seemed unhappy, well, that was between her and God. Then, in the spring of 1863, Eleanor stopped coming to church altogether. Her mother visited the estate and found her daughter pale and thin, moving through the house like a ghost. Eleanor insisted she was fine, just tired, just unwell. Her mother returned to the village with a knot of worry in her chest, but no answers. The vicar called on the Grieves household and was turned away at the door by Thomas, who explained that his wife was resting and could not be disturbed. The blacksmith, Eleanor's father, went to the estate himself. demanding to see his daughter. Thomas let him in. Eleanor appeared. She smiled. She told her father she was happy. She asked him to leave. He left, but he didn't believe her. By the summer of 1863, Eleanor had become a rumor. The village spoke of her in whispers. Some said she was ill. Some said she was with child and confined to bed rest. Some said Thomas had forbidden her to leave the house, though no one could say why. A few of the older women, the ones who remembered darker times, said something else entirely. They said Eleanor was afraid. But afraid of what? Her husband? Or something worse? In August of 1863, Eleanor's mother made one final visit to the estate. She arrived unannounced, early in the morning, and found the front door unlocked. She let herself in. The house was silent. Dust covered the furniture. The curtains were drawn. She called her daughter's name. No answer. She climbed the stairs. She found Eleanor in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Her wrists were bruised. Her hair was unwashed. Her eyes were hollow. "Eleanor," her mother whispered. "What has he done to you?" Eleanor turned. She looked at her mother with an expression that was not fear, not sadness, but something colder, something resigned. "Nothing," she said. "He's done nothing." "Then why?" "You need to leave, Mother." "I won't. Not until you tell me, leave." The word was final. Absolute. Eleanor's mother stood in that bedroom for a long moment, searching her daughter's face for some sign of the girl she had raised. She found none, so she left, and she never saw her daughter alive again. 3 weeks later, on the morning of September 12th, 1863, Thomas Grieves walked into the village with a black armband on his sleeve and tears in his eyes. He went directly to the vicarage and told the vicar that his wife had died in the night. "A fever," he said. "She had been ill for weeks. He had done everything he could, but God had taken her." The vicar expressed his condolences. He asked to see the body. Thomas shook his head. "Too painful," he said. He had already arranged for the burial, a private ceremony, just himself and the gravedigger. He hoped the vicar would understand. The vicar did not understand, but he also did not press. Thomas Grieves was a man of standing, a man of means, and grief, the vicar knew, took many forms. Eleanor was buried that same day in a plot Thomas had purchased on the edge of the churchyard. No funeral, no mourners, just Thomas, the gravedigger, and a coffin that was lowered into the ground before sunset. The gravedigger later told the village that Thomas had insisted on staying until the grave was filled. He had stood there in the rain, watching every shovelful of dirt, as if to make certain the job was done properly. Eleanor's parents were not informed until the next morning. By then, their daughter was already in the ground. The blacksmith demanded to see the body. Thomas refused. The grave had been sealed, he said. It would be disrespectful to disturb it. Eleanor's mother collapsed in the street, wailing that her daughter had been murdered. But there was no proof, no evidence, no witnesses, and Thomas Grieves, standing in the doorway of the vicarage with his hat in his hands and sorrow in his voice, simply said, "I loved my wife, and I will carry this grief until the day I die." The village wanted to believe him, because the alternative was too terrible to consider. But Eleanor's father did not believe, and he did not stop asking questions. Within a month, strange stories began to circulate. A maid who had worked briefly at the Ashford estate claimed she had heard screaming in the night. A traveling merchant said he had seen Thomas loading a heavy trunk into a carriage days before Eleanor's supposed death. A farmer swore he had seen a woman's figure in the upstairs window of the estate weeks after the burial, pale and motionless behind the glass. None of it could be proven, all of it could be dismissed, but the whispers grew louder. And then, in October of 1863, Thomas Grieves left Thornwick. He packed his belongings, locked the Ashford estate, and disappeared without a word. No forwarding address, no explanation. He simply vanished. The village should have forgotten him, should have moved on, but Eleanor's father could not. He petitioned the constable. He wrote to the magistrate. He demanded that his daughter's grave be opened, that her body be examined, that the truth, whatever it was, be brought into the light. The authorities refused. There was no legal grounds, they said, no evidence of foul play, just a grieving father who could not accept his daughter's death. But the blacksmith would not stop. And in his relentless searching, he uncovered something, a letter, hidden in Eleanor's childhood home, tucked between the pages of her Bible, a letter written in her own hand, dated 2 weeks before her death. It was addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. "He knows," It read, "And he will not let me live." The letter changed everything. And nothing. Eleanor's father took it to the constable, his hands trembling as he unfolded the crumpled paper. The constable read it twice. He set it down on his desk and looked at the blacksmith with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much grief turn into obsession. "He knows what?" the constable asked. "What did your daughter mean?" The blacksmith had no answer. The letter offered no context, no explanation, just 5 words that hung in the air like an accusation without a target. The constable made a copy for his records and returned the original. He promised to make inquiries. He promised to follow every lead. But his promises were hollow, and both men knew it. Thomas Grieves was gone. Eleanor was dead. And a cryptic letter from a woman who had died of fever, if that's what it truly was, would not be enough to reopen a sealed grave or launch a criminal investigation. But the blacksmith would not let it go. He began his own investigation, methodical and obsessive. He questioned everyone who had known Thomas. He searched the Ashford estate, breaking through a locked window when no one answered his knocking. The house was empty. Furniture remained, covered in sheets. Dust lay thick on every surface. But Thomas had taken everything personal, his papers, his clothing, anything that might reveal where he had come from or where he had gone. The only thing the blacksmith found was a single room on the 2nd floor, the one that had been Eleanor's, with scratch marks on the inside of the door, deep gouges in the wood, as if someone had tried desperately to claw their way out. He brought the constable to see it. The constable examined the marks, ran his fingers over the splintered wood, and said nothing for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "Could have been there for years. The estate was abandoned before Grieves arrived. Could have been anything. Those marks are fresh," the blacksmith insisted. "Look at the wood. It's pale where it's been torn." The constable looked, and he saw what the blacksmith saw. But seeing and acting were different things. "Even if you're right," he said slowly, "what does it prove? That your daughter was locked in a room? That's not a crime. Not between husband and wife. It is if she died because of it. But we don't know that she did." The blacksmith wanted to scream. Instead, he left the estate and went to the churchyard. He stood over Eleanor's grave, a simple stone marked with her name and the dates of her too short life. And he made a decision. If the law would not help him, he would help himself. He would dig up his daughter's coffin. He would see her body with his own eyes. He would find the truth, whatever it cost him. He planned to do it at night, when the village slept, and the vicar would not catch him desecrating consecrated ground. But he never got the chance, because 3 days before he intended to act, the vicar came to him with a confession. The vicar was a small man, thin and nervous, with the kind of face that always looked guilty even when he had done nothing wrong. He arrived at the blacksmith's home after dark, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of being followed. He sat at the kitchen table and would not meet the blacksmith's eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about your daughter's burial." The blacksmith felt his heart begin to pound. "What about it?" The vicar's hands shook as he spoke. "Thomas Grieves came to me the day before Eleanor died. He said she was very ill. He said she might not survive the night. And he asked me to prepare the burial in advance, to have everything ready, so that if she passed, she could be laid to rest quickly, without delay." Why would he do that? He said it was out of respect, that he didn't want her body to linger, that it would be more dignified to bury her immediately. The blacksmith stared. "And you agreed?" "I had no reason to refuse. He was her husband, and he seemed genuinely distraught. I thought I was helping." "You thought you were helping?" the blacksmith repeated, his voice hollow. "Did you see her body before the burial?" The vicar shook his head. The coffin was already sealed when it arrived at the churchyard. Thomas said he couldn't bear to look at her again, that it was too painful. I respected his wishes. The blacksmith stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You buried my daughter without seeing her body, without confirming she was even in that coffin." "I know," the vicar whispered. "I know, and I've prayed every night since, asking God to forgive me, because I think I may have helped him hide something terrible." The blacksmith wanted to strike him, wanted to wrap his hands around the vicar's throat and squeeze until the guilt turned into something more permanent. But violence would solve nothing. Instead, he asked the only question that mattered. "Will you help me open the grave?" The vicar looked up, his face pale. "I can't. The church forbids it. The law forbids it. I would lose my position. My daughter is in the ground, and you don't know if she was dead when you put her there." The words hung between them. The vicar closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something inside him had shifted. "I'll help," he said quietly. God forgive me. I'll help. They planned it for the following night. Just the two of them, with shovels and a lantern, working in secret under the cover of darkness. But when the blacksmith arrived at the churchyard at midnight, the vicar was not alone. Eleanor's mother was there, and so was the constable. You told them, the blacksmith said, looking at the vicar. I had to, the vicar replied. If we're going to do this, it has to be done properly, with witnesses, so no one can say we tampered with evidence. The constable stepped forward. He looked older in the moonlight, harder. I don't like this, he said, but I like the alternative even less. If there's a chance that woman was buried alive, I need to know. We all need to know. Eleanor's mother said nothing. She stood at the edge of the grave, wrapped in a shawl, her face a mask of grief and dread. She had not wanted to come, but she had needed to. They began to dig. The earth was soft from recent rain. The coffin was only 6 feet down. It took them less than an hour to reach it. When the blacksmith's shovel struck wood, everyone stopped breathing. The constable climbed down into the grave and used a crowbar to pry open the lid. It resisted at first, the nails rusted but still holding. Then, with a groan of splitting wood, it gave way. The smell hit them first. Not decay. It had been only weeks since the burial, but something else. Something wrong. The constable lifted the lantern, casting light into the coffin, and they all saw what was inside. Eleanor's body. Dressed in white, her hands folded over her chest, but her face was wrong. Her mouth was open in a scream. Her eyes were wide, clouded, but still expressing the terror of her final moments. And her hands, the hands that had been so carefully folded, were covered in dried blood. Her fingernails were torn, and the inside of the coffin lid bore the same deep scratches they had seen on the bedroom door. Eleanor's mother made a sound that was not quite human. The vicar turned away and vomited into the grass. The blacksmith fell to his knees, staring at his daughter's face, and understood that he had been right all along. She had been buried alive. She had woken in the darkness, trapped in a box 6 feet underground, and she had died trying to escape. The constable climbed out of the grave, his face ashen. We need a doctor, he said. We need an official examination. This is murder. But when the doctor arrived the next morning and examined Eleanor's remains, he could not say for certain how she had died. Yes, there were signs of distress. Yes, the scratches on the coffin suggested she had been conscious when buried. But had she died of suffocation? Or had she died of the fever Thomas claimed had taken her and merely woken in the coffin during some final delirious moment? The doctor could not say. The decomposition, though minimal, was enough to obscure the truth. There were no visible wounds, no poison in her system that he could detect, no clear evidence of foul play beyond the horror of what had happened inside that coffin. It's possible, the doctor said carefully, that she fell into a coma, that Thomas believed her dead and buried her in good faith, and that she woke too late. And the scratches on her bedroom door? The blacksmith demanded. The bruises on her wrists? The letter she wrote saying he would not let her live? The doctor had no answers. Neither did the constable, because Thomas Grieves was gone, and without him, they had no one to question, no one to accuse, no one to hold accountable. A warrant was issued for Thomas's arrest. His description was circulated to neighboring counties, to London, to the ports, but no one had seen him. No one knew where he had gone. He had vanished as completely as smoke, leaving behind only questions and a grave that should never have been sealed. The village of Thornwick fell into a kind of collective shock. People stopped speaking of the Grieves household. The Ashford estate was abandoned, left to rot on the edge of the moors. No one would go near it. Children were warned to stay away. And slowly, over the course of months and then years, the story began to fade. Not because people forgot, but because remembering was too painful, too disturbing, too close to something they could not explain or control. Eleanor was reburied in a new grave, with a proper funeral this time, attended by the entire village. Her parents never recovered. Her father died 2 years later, his heart broken beyond repair. Her mother lived longer, but never spoke her daughter's name again. And Thomas Grieves became a ghost, a story told in whispers. The man who buried his wife alive, the man who disappeared, the man who was never caught. But the story should have ended there. Should have been forgotten, like so many other tragedies from a darker time. Except it didn't end. Because in 1867, 4 years after Eleanor's death, That farmer's spade struck wood in a field 15 feet from the churchyard. And when the coffin was opened, the scratches on the lid told the same story. A woman buried alive. A woman who died clawing for freedom. But this woman was not Eleanor. The constable who investigated, the same one who had helped dig up Eleanor's grave, knew immediately that something was wrong. The coffin was too similar, the location was too deliberate, and the body, though decomposed beyond recognition, bore the same signs: torn fingernails, a jaw unhinged in a final scream. He ordered the area searched. Within 3 days, they found 2 more coffins, both buried shallow, both in unconsecrated ground, both containing women who had been buried alive. 4 women, 4 coffins, 4 graves that told the same story of unimaginable horror. And Thomas Grieves had been in Thornwick when at least one of them, Eleanor, had died. The investigation exploded. Police from London were called in. The graves were exhumed properly, the remains examined by experts, but the bodies were too decomposed to identify. No missing persons reports matched. No families came forward. It was as if these women had never existed at all, except they had, and someone had put them in the ground while they still breathed. The discovery of 4 bodies transformed Thornwick from a forgotten moorland village into a place of national infamy. Journalists arrived from London and Manchester, filling the village's single inn and crowding the churchyard where Eleanor had been laid to rest. They interviewed everyone: the constable, the vicar, Eleanor's mother, the farmer who had made the first discovery. They wrote breathless accounts of the burial ground of the living dead and the monster of the moors. They printed sketches of the coffins, diagrams of where each had been found, and increasingly wild speculation about the man who had done this. Thomas Grieves became England's most wanted man. His description appeared in every newspaper from Cornwall to Scotland. Tall, dark-haired, well-spoken, approximately 40 years of age, last seen in Thornwick in October 1863, believed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 4 women, possibly more. Reward offered for information leading to his capture. £50 of fortune for most working people. But no one came forward. No sightings were reported. No former neighbors or business associates emerged to claim they had known him. It was as if Thomas Grieves had been a phantom all along, appearing in Thornwick for a single terrible purpose and then dissolving back into nothing. The police investigation, led by Inspector Edward Dalton from Scotland Yard, began with the assumption that they were dealing with a serial murderer. Dalton was a methodical man, known for solving complex cases through patient accumulation of evidence. He established a command post in the village and began working backwards from the bodies. The first body, the one found by the farmer, was designated Victim A. Forensic examination, suggested she had been in the ground between 4 and 6 years, placing her death sometime between 1861 and 1863. She had been approximately 25 to 30 years old, with evidence of healed fractures in her left arm and signs of long-term malnutrition. The coffin was plain pine, constructed cheaply but competently. Most telling were the deep gouges on the interior of the lid and the condition of her hands, every fingernail torn away, the bones of her fingers fractured from the force of her desperate clawing. Victims B and C, found within days of each other, told similar stories. Both women, both buried in the same manner, both showing evidence of having been alive when interred. Victim B had been in the ground slightly longer, perhaps 6 to 7 years. Victim C appeared to be the most recent after Eleanor, buried perhaps 3 to 4 years prior. Victim D, discovered during the expanded search, was the oldest. Preliminary estimates suggested she had been buried 8 to 10 years before her discovery. Her coffin had deteriorated more severely, but the evidence was unmistakable. She too had died underground, conscious and terrified. Inspector Dalton mapped the burial locations. They formed an irregular arc, stretching from the edge of the churchyard into the unconsecrated moorland beyond. Eleanor's official grave stood at one end of this arc. The most recently discovered coffin, Victim A, lay at the other. It was, Dalton realized, a progression, a timeline written in bodies. Thomas Grieves had been burying women alive for nearly a decade, and Eleanor had simply been the last. But why? That was the question that consumed Dalton. Most murderers had comprehensible motives: greed, passion, revenge, madness. But burying someone alive required extraordinary cruelty. It meant condemning the victim to hours, perhaps even days of conscious suffering. It meant hearing them scream beneath the earth as you walked away. It meant choosing the most horrific death imaginable, when simpler methods would have served equally well. Unless the suffering itself was the point. Dalton interviewed everyone who had known Thomas Grieves during his time in Thornwick. The picture that emerged was frustratingly incomplete. Thomas had been charming but distant, generous with money but secretive about its source. He had no visitors, received no letters, conducted no visible business. He had appeared in the village with wealth and education that set him apart, and he had left the same way without explanation or trace. He was always watching, the innkeeper's wife told Dalton.
That's what I remember most. He'd sit in the corner of the public room with a glass of wine, and his eyes would follow people. Not in an obvious way.
But you'd feel it, like he was studying you, measuring you. Measuring you for what? Dalton asked. She shivered. I couldn't say, but it made my skin crawl. Others reported similar impressions. Thomas had been pleasant in conversation, but somehow hollow. He smiled at the right moments, said the right things, but there was nothing genuine behind it. Like an actor playing a role, the vicar said. Like he'd learned how to be human but hadn't quite mastered it. Dalton turned his attention to Eleanor's letter. He knows, and he will not let me live. What had Thomas known? What secret had Eleanor carried that was worth killing for? The answer, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. A woman named Margaret Ashworth, who had worked briefly as a maid in the Grieves household, came forward 2 weeks into the investigation. She had left Thornwick years earlier to work in York and had only just learned of the discoveries through the newspapers. She was terrified to speak, she said, because Thomas had threatened her, but conscience demanded it. Margaret told Dalton that she had worked for the Grieves for only 3 months in early 1863, before Eleanor's death. During that time, she had witnessed things that haunted her still. Thomas, she said, had kept Eleanor under strict control. She was not permitted to leave the house without his permission. She was not allowed to receive visitors unless he was present. She ate meals alone in her room, and on several occasions, Margaret had heard Eleanor weeping behind locked doors. I asked Mrs. Grieves once if she was all right, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with the saddest eyes I've ever seen and said, "He knows what I am, and he'll never forgive me for it." What did she mean? Dalton asked. I don't know. I asked her to explain, but Mr. Grieves appeared before she could answer. He dismissed me on the spot, told me to leave the house immediately and never return. He gave me £10 more than I'd earned in wages and said if I ever spoke of what I'd seen or heard, he would make sure I regretted it. I believed him. Dalton pressed her for more details. Had Eleanor seemed ill? Had there been any indication she was being poisoned or physically harmed? Margaret shook her head. Eleanor had seemed frightened, withdrawn, but not physically injured. It was her mind he was breaking, Margaret said. He wanted her to suffer. I could see it in how he looked at her, like she was something disgusting that he had to punish. This testimony opened a new avenue of investigation. If Thomas had been punishing Eleanor for something, she was not something she had done, but something inherent to her nature, then perhaps that same motive applied to the other victims. Perhaps they had all shared some characteristic that Thomas found intolerable, some quality that marked them for his particular brand of torture. Dalton sent inquiries to every parish within 50 miles of Thornwick, searching for missing women whose disappearances might correspond to the burial timeline. The responses were disappointing. Many women went missing every year, servants who ran off with lovers, wives who fled abusive husbands, prostitutes who simply vanished from the streets. But none of the cases matched the physical descriptions of the victims. None had any connection to Thomas Grieves or to Thornwick. It was as if these women had been ghosts even before they died. The investigation stalled. Weeks became months. The journalists left Thornwick, moving on to fresher scandals. The reward for Thomas's capture went unclaimed. Inspector Dalton returned to London, taking with him boxes of evidence and a growing certainty that he would never solve this case. But the story refused to die completely, because in 1869, 2 years after the bodies were discovered, a man matching Thomas Grieves' description was spotted in Liverpool. He was boarding a ship bound for America, traveling under the name Thomas Granger. A constable recognized him from the wanted posters and attempted to detain him. The man fled. In the chase that followed, he ran into a narrow alley and seemingly vanished. The constable searched for hours but found nothing. It was as if the man had melted into the shadows. Word reached Inspector Dalton, who traveled to Liverpool to investigate. He interviewed the constable, examined the alley where the suspect had disappeared, and reviewed the passenger manifest of the ship. A Thomas Granger had indeed booked passage to New York, but he had never boarded. His ticket went unused. His luggage, a single trunk, was never claimed. Dalton had the trunk opened. Inside were men's clothing, a few books, and a leather journal. The journal was filled with handwriting that matched samples of Thomas Grieves' correspondence from his time in Thornwick. But the contents were coded letters and numbers arranged in sequences that Dalton could not decipher. He brought the journal to cryptographers, to academics, to anyone who might unlock its secrets. No one succeeded. The last entry in the journal was dated the 10th of September 1863, 2 days before Thomas had announced Eleanor's death. It consisted of a single sentence in plain English, surrounded by coded text. "The fourth is complete. The sin is buried. I am free." The fourth. Eleanor had been the fourth. And if Thomas considered himself free after her death, it suggested his purpose had been fulfilled. Whatever he had been doing, whatever compulsion had driven him to bury women alive, had reached its conclusion with Eleanor. But what sin? Whose sin? Eleanor's? Or Thomas's own? Dalton never found the answer. The journal remained undeciphered. The Liverpool sighting was never confirmed. And Thomas Grieves, if that had truly been him, was never seen again. The case officially closed in 1872, marked as unsolved. The 4 bodies from Thornwick were buried together in a mass grave with a simple stone marker reading, "Unknown women, may they rest in peace." Eleanor remained in her separate plot, her name preserved even as her story faded into local legend. But the questions lingered, and over the decades that followed, as Thornwick returned to its quiet obscurity, people still wondered. Historians and amateur sleuths attempted to trace Thomas Grieves' origins, to find records of his birth or education or employment. They found nothing. It was as if he had sprung into existence fully formed in 1862 and disappeared just as completely in 1863. Some theorized he had been a religious fanatic, punishing women he believed to be sinners. Others suggested he was a sadist who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. A few proposed he had been experimenting with premature burial as part of some twisted scientific inquiry. But none of these theories explained the coded journal, the careful selection of victims, or the ritualistic nature of the burials. The truth, if there was one, died with Thomas Grieves. Or perhaps it never existed at all. Perhaps there was no grand motive, no comprehensible reason. Perhaps Thomas was simply a void in human form, a man who destroyed because destruction was his nature, and who chose the cruelest method imaginable because cruelty satisfied something fundamental in his soul. Eleanor's mother, in the years before her death, would sometimes walk to her daughter's grave and stand there for hours, speaking to the stone as if her child could still hear. A neighbor who witnessed one of these visits reported that the old woman had said something chilling. "You knew what he was. You tried to warn us, and we didn't listen." What had Eleanor known? What had she discovered about her husband that sealed her fate? And why had she married him in the first place, if she had sensed the darkness in him? There are no answers. Only graves. Only silence. Only the terrible knowledge that somewhere, perhaps, Thomas Grieves lived out his days unpunished, carrying the weight of 4 women's screams in his memory. Or perhaps he didn't. Perhaps guilt consumed him, and he ended his own life in some forgotten corner of the world. We'll never know. But here's what we do know. The Ashford estate still stands on the edge of Thornwick, abandoned and crumbling. No one has lived there since 1863. And on certain nights, villagers swear they can hear sounds coming from the ruins. Not voices exactly. More like scratching, like fingernails dragging across wood, like someone trapped and desperate, clawing to get out. They say history buries its sins. But sometimes, those sins refuse to stay buried. Before you go, I want you to think about something. 4 women died in unimaginable terror because one man decided their existence was an affront to him, and he was never caught, never punished, never made to answer for what he did. That's not unusual. History is full of monsters who walked away clean, full of graves that hold secrets no one wants to exhume, full of victims whose names we've forgotten and whose suffering we've chosen not to see. So here's my question for you. What other horrors has history buried? What other Thomas Grieves walked among us, smiling and charming and hiding something unspeakable beneath the surface? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share your own local legends, your own dark history. Because these stories matter. Not despite their horror, but because of it. They remind us that evil is not always obvious, that monsters often look like everyone else, and that silence, the choice to forget, to move on, to let the past stay buried, is sometimes the greatest sin of all. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine, hit that subscribe button. There are more forgotten nightmares waiting to be uncovered, more truths that history tried to hide. And I'm going to keep digging them up, one grave at a time. Like the video if you want to see more dark history like this. Share it with someone who appreciates the macabre, the unsolved, the stories that refuse to fade. And remember, the past is never really dead. It's just waiting underground, scratching at the lid of its coffin, hoping someone will finally let it out.